The shadow man at the foot of your bed. A global experience. You wake in the night, or you think you wake, though your body won't move, won't respond to the urgent commands your conscious mind is sending, leaving you paralyzed while awareness returns with terrifying clarity. And there's a figure at the foot of your bed. Not a person, not exactly, but a human-shaped absence. A silhouette darker than the surrounding darkness. A presence that radiates malevolence, or at minimum attention so intense it feels like weight pressing against your chest, making breathing difficult, making terror absolute. The figure is tall, typically male in shape, though featureless, composed entirely of shadow or darkness that seems to absorb light rather than merely blocking it, and it's watching you with an intensity you can feel, despite it having no visible eyes, no face, nothing but the human-shaped void standing there at the foot of your bed while you lie paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream, unable to look away or close your eyes or do anything, except endure the presence until something shifts. The figure vanishes, or you fully wake, or consciousness slips back into sleep, leaving you with the memory of the encounter, the certainty that something was there, something saw you in your most vulnerable state, something malevolent, or at minimum profoundly other, stood in your bedroom and watched you while you couldn't move, or defend yourself, or escape. This experience is reported globally, across cultures, across demographics, across time periods, with such consistency that it constitutes one of the most common paranormal experiences humans report, described in remarkably similar terms, despite experiencers having no contact with each other. No shared cultural framework that would explain the uniformity of the phenomenon, suggesting either that sleep paralysis combined with universal human psychological patterns creates this specific hallucinatory experience independently in millions of people, or that something external is actually occurring, that the shadow man is real entity or phenomenon, rather than internally generated hallucination, that he appears at the foot of beds globally because he exists, because he accesses sleeping humans during the vulnerable state when consciousness returns before motor control does, when you're aware but helpless, when you're perfect audience for whatever the shadow man is or wants, making these encounters either the most consistent cross-cultural hallucination humans experience or evidence of something genuinely external, something that visits sleeping humans, something that stands and watches with terrible attention, something that has been doing this for as long as humans have slept and will continue doing it, appearing at the foot of your bed, standing in your bedroom, watching you while you're paralyzed until you finally break free or until he vanishes, leaving you alone in the darkness, wondering whether what you experienced was real, or whether your brain constructed it, whether the shadow man exists, or whether he's generated by sleep paralysis and evolved fear responses that create the same figure independently in experiencers worldwide, making him either real visitor from somewhere beyond our normal reality or the most universal nightmare humans generate. The figure who stands at the foot of the bed, who watches from the shadows, who appears during sleep paralysis with such consistency that millions have seen him, have felt his presence, have experienced the specific terror of waking paralyzed with the shadow man in their room, standing there, watching, waiting, being whatever he is, hallucination, entity, consciousness phenomenon, dimensional visitor, or something else that doesn't fit categories we have. Something that makes the shadow man real in experience, even if not real in physical space, real in consciousness, even if not real in shared objective reality, leaving the question of what he is suspended between neuroscience and paranormal investigation, between sleep research and entity encounter, between the explicable and the mysterious, where the shadow man exists as he has always existed, at the foot of your bed, in the darkness, watching, waiting, present in the moment between sleep and wake when you're paralyzed and vulnerable and aware. The medical explanation for the shadow man is sleep paralysis with accompanying hypnopompic hallucinations, the state where consciousness returns before the muscle atonia that prevents acting out dreams has released, creating temporary paralysis while awareness is present, often accompanied by hallucinations that can be visual, auditory, or tactile, frequently including sensations of presence, pressure on chest, difficulty breathing, and feelings of intense fear or dread. Sleep paralysis is a well-documented phenomenon, occurring in approximately 8% of the population at least once in their lifetime, more frequently in those with disrupted sleep schedules, sleep deprivation, narcolepsy, or certain psychological conditions. The hallucinations that accompany sleep paralysis are generated by the brain during the transition between sleep states, often incorporating threat perception because the paralysis itself triggers fear response. Being unable to move activates survival circuits that interpret the situation as danger, and the brain constructs explanatory hallucinations of threats that would justify the fear and paralysis you're experiencing. This framework explains the shadow man as internally generated figure, a hallucination that takes human-shaped form because humans are hardwired to detect human figures, particularly potential threats, making the hypnopompic hallucination default to humanoid shape that's perceived as threatening because the physiological fear response is already active from the paralysis itself. The consistency of the experience across cultures would reflect universal human neurology. Everyone has similar brain architecture, similar fear responses, similar tendency to hallucinate threatening human-shaped figures during vulnerable paralyzed states, creating the shadow man independently in millions of experiencers through convergent psychological and neurological processes, rather than through actual external entity visiting. But this explanation, while scientifically respectable and accounting for many features of the phenomenon, struggles with certain aspects of the reports. The specificity of the shadow man's appearance, dark, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, typically male-shaped, positioned at foot of bed rather than randomly located, exhibiting behavior that suggests awareness and attention rather than being static hallucination, seems remarkably uniform for internally generated experience. Hallucinations vary widely between individuals, based on personal psychology, cultural background, recent experiences. Yet the shadow man appears in consistent form across these variables, suggesting either that the constraints of sleep paralysis hallucinations are tighter than we'd expect, narrowly channeling diverse human minds into producing very similar entities, or that something external is actually being perceived. The historical documentation of the shadow man predates modern sleep paralysis research. Accounts of malevolent entities appearing during sleep, sitting on chests, inducing paralysis and terror, appear in folklore globally. The incubus and succubus in European tradition, the old hag in Newfoundland, the Kanashibari in Japan, various night attack spirits across indigenous cultures worldwide. These traditions describe experiences identical to modern sleep paralysis, with shadow man encounters, using cultural frameworks available at the time. Demons, spirits, supernatural assault, to explain what we now interpret through neurological frameworks. The continuity across centuries and cultures suggests that whatever generates these experiences is a consistent feature of human neurology that manifests similarly regardless of when or where it occurs. The commonality with the Hatman phenomenon is notable. Both are shadow figures encountered during altered consciousness states. Both are described as human-shaped darkness. Both generate profound fear responses. Some experiencers report distinct differences between the two. The Hatman has the distinctive hat, and sometimes coat, appears in various contexts beyond just bedroom encounters. While the Shadow Man is more specifically associated with sleep paralysis and bedroom appearances, others report them as variants of the same phenomenon, with appearance details varying between encounters. Whether they're different entities or different cultural descriptions of the same experience remains ambiguous. The entity interpretation treats the Shadow Man as external being rather than hallucination, as something that exists independently and that accesses humans during sleep paralysis when consciousness is partially disengaged from the body, creating vulnerability that allows the entity to become visible or present. In this framework, sleep paralysis isn't causing the Shadow Man hallucination. It's creating the conditions where an always present entity becomes perceptible, where the barriers that normally prevent humans from seeing entities that exist in adjacent dimensional or consciousness states temporarily weaken, allowing the Shadow Man to be seen or sensed by the sleeper who is caught between states, and therefore able to perceive what's normally hidden. This interpretation invokes various explanatory frameworks. The Shadow Man might be an interdimensional entity that exists in reality layers as parallel to ours, and that can access our dimension when human consciousness is in transitional state. He might be consciousness level, being rather than physically present, existing in minds or in collective unconscious, and manifesting when individual consciousness reaches states that allow his perception. He might be parasitic or predatory entity that feeds on fear or life energy, appearing during sleep paralysis because paralyzed, terrified humans provide optimal conditions for whatever sustenance he requires. Or he might be observer or monitor, entity tasked with watching humans for purposes we can't comprehend, taking advantage of vulnerable paralyzed state to conduct his observations. The malevolence versus neutrality question is significant. Most experiencers describe feeling threatened by the Shadow Man's presence, perceiving malevolent intent, or at minimum disturbing attention that feels predatory. But is the Shadow Man actually malevolent? Or does his appearance during state of fear create interpretation of threat where none exists? If you're already terrified from sleep paralysis, any presence will seem threatening. Any attention will feel malevolent, making it difficult to determine the Shadow Man's actual nature or intent, separate from the experiencer's fear state perception. Some accounts describe the Shadow Man moving, leaning closer, sometimes touching, or creating sensation of pressure, or even sitting on the chest, consistent with incubus/old hag traditions of entity that physically oppresses the sleeper. These tactile elements might be hallucinatory. The pressure on chest is physiological effect of breathing difficulty during paralysis, interpreted as entity pressing down. Or they might represent actual interaction if the Shadow Man is external entity capable of physical or energetic contact with humans in paralyzed state. The aftermath effects vary. Most experiencers report fear that persists beyond the immediate encounter, reluctance to sleep, hypervigilance in their bedrooms, lasting sense of violation from having been watched in vulnerable state. Some report recurring encounters suggesting the Shadow Man returns. That initial experience creates connection or vulnerability that makes subsequent appearances more likely. Whether recurrence reflects increased awareness, causing recognition of previously ignored sleep paralysis episodes, reflects psychological pattern where expectation creates repeated experiences, or reflects actual repeated visitation by entity, depends on which framework you accept. The attempts to interact with the Shadow Man are rare because paralysis prevents speech and movement, limiting interaction to mental engagement or attempts at communication through thought. Some experiencers report trying to challenge the figure mentally, asserting authority over their space, attempting to banish or dismiss the presence through will or prayer or internal commands. Success rates are difficult to assess. If the Shadow Man vanishes, Was it responding to the command, or was the sleep paralysis episode ending naturally at that moment? If he remains despite commands, does that prove he's external and autonomous? Or does it prove that hallucinations don't respond to commands because they're generated by brain processes rather than being external entities you can communicate with? The protective measures people adopt reflect beliefs about the Shadow Man's nature. Those who interpret him as hallucination work on improving sleep hygiene, reducing stress, addressing sleep disorders, understanding the physiology to reduce fear when episodes occur. Those who interpret him as entity attempt spiritual protection, prayers, blessings, protective symbols, cleansing rituals, religious practices from various traditions intended to prevent the Shadow Man from accessing the bedroom or from manifesting during sleep. Whether these protective measures work reflects either that addressing sleep problems reduces sleep paralysis frequency, or that spiritual protection genuinely prevents entity access, or that psychological confidence from protective measures reduces fear and thereby reduces interpretation of paralysis experiences as Shadow Man encounters. The scientific studies of sleep paralysis document the physiological and neurological aspects, the REM atonia that causes paralysis, the brain activity patterns during episodes, the demographic factors that predict frequency, but don't definitively settle whether accompanying hallucinations are purely internal or whether they incorporate perception of external phenomena that are normally inaccessible to waking consciousness. Testing whether entities exist during sleep paralysis would require detecting them through instruments during episodes when experiencers report presences. But designing such experiments faces enormous methodological challenges. How do you detect an entity that might exist in consciousness space rather than physical space? What instruments would be appropriate? How do you distinguish between detecting actual entity versus detecting the brain activity that generates hallucination of entity? The cultural interpretation differences are revealing. Western secular materialist culture defaults to neurological explanation. It's hallucination, it's brain-generated, it's sleep paralysis phenomenon that's frightening but ultimately harmless and explainable through neuroscience. Many traditional and religious cultures default to entity interpretation. It's spirit, demon, dimensional being, something external that attacks or observes during vulnerable sleep states. Neither cultural framework has definitive proof, and experiencers' interpretations tend to align with their prior beliefs about whether entities exist and whether consciousness is purely physical, or whether it can perceive non-physical realities. The question of why the Shadow Man appears at the foot of the bed specifically, rather than beside the bed or elsewhere in the room, might relate to visual perception during paralysis. If experiencers tend to be lying in specific positions and their eye movement and visual focus are constrained by paralysis, the foot of the bed might be where figures naturally appear in their visual field. Or if the Shadow Man is external entity, the foot of the bed might be strategic position, far enough away that immediate physical threat isn't implied, close enough that presence is undeniable, positioned where the sleeper can see him without being able to easily look away, creating optimal conditions for whatever purpose the observation or encounter serves. The Shadow Man's darkness, his light-absorbing quality, is consistently described in ways that suggest he's not merely dark-colored, but is composed of darkness itself, is an absence rather than a presence, is void in human shape. This darkness could be hallucinatory artifact. The brain during sleep paralysis generates figure from shadows and darkness in the room, creating entity from existing dark spaces, rather than generating fully formed independent visual hallucination. Or if the Shadow Man is external, his darkness might be his actual nature, might be how entities from adjacent dimensions or consciousness states appear when they manifest in physical space, might be the visual representation of something that doesn't have physical form, but that consciousness perceives as dark, human-shaped void. Because that's the closest approximation available to perception systems designed for physical reality. Whether the Shadow Man is universal hallucination or universal visitor, whether he's generated by your paralyzed sleeping brain, or whether he's actually there standing at the foot of your bed when you can't move, the experience is real and is traumatic and is shared by millions of humans across history and geography, creating one of the most consistent paranormal or consciousness experiences our species reports. The Shadow Man exists in the space between sleep and wake, between consciousness and unconsciousness, between hallucination and perception, between internal and external, between the explicable and the mysterious, standing there at the foot of countless beds, watching countless paralyzed sleepers, being whatever he is: nightmare, entity, consciousness phenomenon, dimensional visitor, neurological hallucination, collective archetype, or something else that combines elements of all these explanations into something that our current frameworks can't fully capture, something that makes the Shadow Man real in experience, even if his metaphysical status remains uncertain, something that ensures that tonight, somewhere in the world, someone will wake paralyzed with the Shadow Man at the foot of their bed, standing in the darkness, watching with terrible attention that might be internally generated projection, or might be external observation, might be brain-creating fear figure during vulnerable state, or might be entity taking advantage of vulnerability to manifest and observe, leaving the question of what the Shadow Man actually is forever suspended between the explanations, forever ambiguous, forever terrifying. Regardless of which interpretation is correct, because waking paralyzed with a dark figure watching you is horrifying, whether that figure is hallucination your brain created or entity that actually exists, whether he's in your mind or in your room, whether he's nightmare or visitor, leaving the Shadow Man as permanent fixture of human experience, permanent feature of sleep paralysis encounters, permanent mystery that stands at the intersection of neuroscience and paranormal investigation, at the boundary between brain-generated experience and potentially external phenomenon, at the foot of your bed when you wake paralyzed, standing there in the darkness, watching, being real, or being hallucination, or being something that makes the distinction irrelevant, because the experience is real, and the fear is real, and the Shadow Man is there, whether he exists or not, whether he's entity or hallucination, whether he's visiting or whether you're generating him, standing there as he has stood for thousands of years at the feet of beds and sleeping mats and wherever humans have slept and experienced the paralysis and seen the figure in the darkness, the Shadow Man who watches, who waits, who exists in the liminal space between states of consciousness where the most profound and disturbing human experiences occur, where we're most vulnerable, where we're caught between worlds, and where he stands, always stands, forever stands, watching from the darkness at the foot of your bed. The Russian sleep experiment, the horror of forced wakefulness. In the late 1940s, during the depths of Stalinist paranoia and human experimentation that characterized the early Cold War, Soviet researchers allegedly conducted an experiment that would reveal something terrifying about human consciousness and the nature of sleep itself. The story describes 5 political prisoners who were promised freedom if they could remain awake for 30 consecutive days, while exposed to an experimental stimulant gas. They were sealed in a chamber with books, cots, running water, and enough food to last the month. Microphones allowed researchers to monitor their conversations. Small portholes allowed visual observation. What began as a psychological endurance test became a descent into something far darker, revealing that sleep might not simply be rest for the body, but a necessary barrier that keeps something else contained. something that wakes when we cannot. The first few days proceeded as expected. The subjects remained awake, talking amongst themselves, reading, maintaining relatively normal behavior, despite the artificial stimulation keeping their bodies and minds from shutting down. By the 5th day, conversations became darker. The prisoners stopped talking about their past lives, their families, their hopes for freedom. Instead, they began discussing increasingly paranoid topics, questioning the motives of their captors, expressing distrust of each other. By day 9, one subject began screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, screaming at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight until his vocal cords damaged, and he could only produce a rasping whisper. The others showed no reaction, didn't try to stop him or comfort him, simply went about their activities as if nothing unusual was happening. By the 14th day, the researchers noted that the subjects had stopped speaking entirely. The microphones picked up wet, tearing sounds, but no conversation. When observers looked through the portholes, they saw that the subjects had used their own fingernails and pages from the books to stuff the drains and cover the observation windows from the inside. They no longer wanted to be watched, or something inside them no longer wanted to be seen. The chamber remained silent except for those disturbing wet sounds that suggested flesh being torn, movements being made, activities occurring that the observers could no longer monitor or document. After 15 days of silence, the research team made a decision. They would use the intercom to test if the subjects were still conscious, still alive. The announcement was simple. We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom. The response that came back through the intercom, in a calm voice that sounded both human and not quite right, stated, "We no longer want to be freed." The words were clear, articulated with strange precision, as if whoever spoke was carefully forming each syllable with effort or unfamiliarity. The research team waited another 5 days before opening the chamber, partly from fear of what they might find, partly from orders to document the full 30-day period. When they finally unsealed the door on day 30, the scene inside defied rational explanation. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, though alive seemed like an inadequate term for their condition. They had torn off their own flesh, strips of skin and muscle peeled away from their bodies, as if they were trying to remove something or reveal what was underneath. The wounds showed no normal infection despite being open for weeks. Instead, they had a strange, almost preserved quality, as if the gas or their altered metabolism had prevented normal decay or healing. One subject was dead, lying in the center of the room. The others had eaten parts of him, not out of starvation. There was still food remaining unopened, but apparently by choice, by compulsion, by something that had overridden normal human revulsion. The subject's behavior when the soldiers entered the chamber was perhaps most disturbing. They showed no pain despite their horrific self-inflicted injuries. They resisted violently when soldiers tried to remove them, demonstrating strength that shouldn't have been possible given their physical condition. They begged not to be released, but to be sealed back in the chamber with the gas turned on. They pleaded with desperate intensity to be kept awake, to not be allowed to sleep, as if sleep itself had become the thing they feared most. The surviving subjects were forcibly removed to a medical facility. As doctors attempted to sedate them for treatment, the subjects fought with inhuman strength and endurance. One tore his own muscles trying to resist restraints. Another managed to speak during the struggle, his words recorded by a researcher. "Have you forgotten so terribly what you are? We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread. The words suggested something speaking through the subject, something that had been given voice by the extended wakefulness, by the breakdown of whatever barriers sleep normally maintains. When the gas was finally stopped and the subjects began to lose consciousness, their fear was absolute. As they were forced towards sleep, their bodies began shutting down completely, as if whatever was animating them couldn't exist in a sleeping state and was willing to destroy the host rather than return to dormancy. 3 of the remaining 4 died within hours of being taken off the stimulant. The last survivor was kept under sedation, and according to the story, he was eventually euthanized when it became clear that consciousness only returned what had spoken through him, not the original human personality. This account has circulated widely, especially on internet forums dedicated to horror stories and unexplained phenomena. Many dismiss it as pure fiction, a creepypasta created for entertainment, noting the lack of documentation, the absence of names and specific locations, the theatrical nature of the narrative. Russian historians point out that while Soviet human experimentation certainly occurred, there's no verified record of this specific experiment. The story hits familiar horror beats, isolated subjects, gradual transformation, disturbing revelations that suggest creative writing rather than historical documentation. Yet the story persists and spreads precisely because it touches on something we instinctively recognize as possible, even if this specific account is fabricated. Sleep deprivation does cause psychosis. Extended wakefulness does produce hallucinations, paranoia, and radical personality changes. Laboratory animals forced to remain awake for extended periods die, even when provided food and water, as if sleep serves a function so fundamental that its absence is eventually fatal. Human prisoners subjected to sleep deprivation as torture report experiences that align with elements of the Russian sleep experiment. Sensations of presence, of something else emerging in their consciousness, of reality becoming fluid and nightmarish. The scientific understanding of why we sleep remains incomplete. We know the body performs repair functions during sleep, that the brain consolidates memories and clears metabolic waste, that certain hormones are regulated through sleep cycles. But these explanations feel insufficient for something so universal and so critical. Every mammal sleeps, despite the vulnerability it creates. Sleep evolved and persisted despite being a state where the organism can't flee predators, find food, or reproduce. Whatever purpose sleep serves must be absolutely essential to override these survival disadvantages. Some researchers have explored the idea that consciousness itself requires periodic shutdown, that the continuous processing of sensory input and self-awareness generates byproducts or states that must be cleared through sleep. Dreams might be the mind processing and integrating experiences, or they might be something stranger. Glimpses of consciousness operating without sensory anchoring, revealing other layers of reality that waking perception filters out. The boundary between waking and sleeping consciousness is where strange experiences cluster. Sleep paralysis, lucid dreaming, hypnagogic hallucinations, that sense of falling just as you drift off, or the feeling of presence in the room when no one is there. The concept that sleep keeps something contained, that wakefulness maintained too long allows something else to emerge, appears in various cultural and religious traditions. Demons and entities are often described as becoming more active at night when humans are vulnerable in sleep. Insomnia and sleeplessness are associated with madness and possession. The phrase "the witching hour" suggests certain times when barriers thin, when what's normally separate can cross over. These might be superstitions born from the fear and vulnerability of darkness, or they might reflect genuine observation that consciousness operates differently when tired, when sleep-deprived, when pushed beyond normal limits of wakefulness. Modern sleep deprivation research, conducted under ethical oversight, with subjects who can withdraw at any time, has documented cognitive breakdown occurring remarkably quickly. After 72 hours without sleep, hallucinations become common. Subjects report seeing things that aren't there, hearing voices, experiencing paranoid delusions. Their personality changes, sometimes becoming aggressive or withdrawn, sometimes exhibiting childlike behavior or inappropriate emotional responses. The longer they remain awake, the more dramatic the alterations become. While these studies don't approach the 30-day duration described in the Russian experiment, they demonstrate that extended wakefulness genuinely does transform human consciousness in disturbing ways. The question of what speaks through sleep-deprived individuals is worth considering. When someone experiences stimulant psychosis or sleep deprivation hallucinations, are they simply experiencing misfiring neurons, exhausted brains producing random signals that get interpreted as perception? Or is the fatigue lowering barriers that normally keep certain perceptions out, allowing awareness of things that exist but are usually filtered from consciousness? The consistency of certain experiences across cultures and individuals, shadow figures, sense of presence, feelings of being watched, suggests either universal brain architecture, producing similar hallucinations, or universal perception of something that's actually there but normally invisible. The Russian sleep experiment story, whether true as described or fictional, serves as a modern mythology exploring ancient fears about consciousness, sleep, and what might exist in the spaces between waking and dreaming. It suggests that sleep isn't just rest, but a necessary barrier, that consciousness isn't a single unified thing, but contains layers, and that keeping those layers forced into continuous activation reveals aspects of mind or reality that are meant to remain dormant. The image of subjects begging not to sleep, preferring physical destruction to the unconsciousness that would return them to normal human limitation, implies that what they experienced in forced wakefulness was more real, more significant, perhaps more truthful than ordinary consciousness. Whether Soviet researchers actually conducted this experiment in the 1940s, whether something similar occurred in other contexts that inspired the story, or whether this is entirely creative fiction, the underlying premise resonates because it addresses genuine mysteries about sleep and consciousness that science hasn't fully resolved. We spend roughly a third of our lives unconscious, vulnerable, dreaming. We die without it. Our minds transform radically when deprived of it. And somewhere in the transition between waking and sleeping, in that liminal space where consciousness shifts states, things happen that we don't fully understand. Experiences occur that suggest reality might be more complex, more layered, more strange than our waking minds can normally perceive. The Russian sleep experiment takes these observations to their darkest conclusion, asking what we might discover if we could never sleep again. If consciousness was forced to remain active beyond its designed limits, if the thing that sleep keeps quiet was finally given continuous opportunity to speak. The staircase in the woods, mysterious structures that appear in forests, deep in forests where few people venture, miles from roads or trails, or any evidence of human habitation. Park rangers and hikers occasionally encounter something that makes no sense, something that shouldn't exist and has no logical explanation for being where it is. It's a staircase, perfectly constructed, rising from the forest floor into nothing. Steps leading up to empty air, as if the house they once served simply vanished while the stairs remained. They're not ruins in the traditional sense. They're not crumbling or overgrown or showing centuries of decay. They're often in remarkably good condition, made of wood or stone or metal, structurally sound, sometimes even looking recently built despite being in locations where no construction equipment could have reached them and where no foundations or other building remnants exist anywhere nearby. Just stairs, ascending from nowhere to nowhere, standing in the middle of wilderness as if they were waiting for something, as if they serve a purpose that we can't see, as if they're markers or doorways or traps created by intelligence that understands something about forest spaces that humans don't. Placed with intention, we'll never comprehend unless we're foolish enough to climb them and discover what happens when you ascend stairs that lead to nothing in places where they shouldn't exist at all. The phenomenon became widely known through accounts from search and rescue personnel, particularly stories shared online by park rangers describing the strangest things they've encountered during operations. Among the reports of bizarre disappearances, unexplained sounds, and disturbing discoveries, the staircases stood out for their specific wrongness. Rangers describe finding them in locations so remote that getting construction materials there would require helicopter transport. Yet there's no evidence of recent human activity, no tool marks that look modern, no trash or disturbance that accompanies construction sites. The stairs just exist, sometimes wooden staircases that look like they belong to Victorian houses, sometimes stone steps that appear ancient, sometimes metal, fire escape style stairs that look industrial, all standing alone in the forest with no other structures visible anywhere in the surrounding terrain. The rangers report being told during training never to approach the stairs, never to climb them, never to touch them if possible, and absolutely never to go near them if you're alone. This is an official policy written in any manual, but rather knowledge passed down from experienced personnel to new recruits. Warnings given in serious tones that suggest these aren't superstitions, but safety protocols, based on actual incidents that aren't discussed publicly. When pressed for explanation, the veterans don't provide details, just reiterate that the stairs are dangerous in ways that aren't obvious, that people who've interacted with them have disappeared or been found in conditions that suggest something terrible happened, that the official stance is to note the location and avoid the area, never acknowledge them in written reports, never tell civilians about them, and absolutely never, under any circumstances, climb them. What happens if you climb the stairs is the subject of speculation and fragmentary accounts that are difficult to verify. Some stories describe people ascending the stairs and simply disappearing, never reaching the top, because at some point between steps, they transition to somewhere else, cease to exist in normal space, get pulled into whatever dimension or state the stairs actually connect to. Other accounts involve climbers reaching the top and experiencing disorientation, lost time, finding themselves in different locations than where they started with no memory of how they traveled the distance, or developing psychological issues that manifest as paranoia, persistent sense of being watched, or obsessive behavior around patterns and numbers. There are also descriptions of climbers returning from the stairs, physically present, but fundamentally changed, their personalities different, their memories altered, their bodies showing injuries or marks that have no explainable cause. They might speak about seeing things from the top of the stairs, vistas that don't match the forest they're actually in, skies that are the wrong color, or feeling that something was watching them from above as they climbed, something that lives where the stairs lead, something that permits ascent but might not permit descent, something that decides on a case-by-case basis whether you're allowed to return or whether you'll stay wherever the stairs actually go. The construction of the stairs is often anachronistic, styles and methods that don't match the age of the forest around them, or that use materials that weren't available in that region during periods when the construction style was common. Victorian-style carved wooden staircases found in forests that weren't settled until the mid-20th century. Stone steps with architectural features from European castles located in American wilderness where no such structures were ever built. Industrial metal stairs showing rust patterns that suggest decades of exposure, yet appearing in locations where metal construction has never occurred and where the rust should have progressed much further given the apparent age. The positioning is also wrong. They're not always on flat ground. Sometimes they ascend from hillsides at angles that would make them useless for any practical purpose, starting partway up a slope and climbing at a pitch that suggests they were designed for a structure that was oriented differently than the terrain they now occupy. Sometimes they're in ravines or beside streams where no foundation could support a building, where water would have undermined any structure. Yet the stairs remain stable and solid, despite lacking proper footings or connection to anything that would explain why they haven't collapsed. Animals avoid the stairs. Deer trails go around them rather than near them. Birds don't land on them. Insects don't build webs or nests in them. The exclusion zone around each staircase varies, but is consistently present, as if wildlife senses something about them that triggers instinctive avoidance, that marks them as territory or objects that shouldn't be approached by living things. This animal behavior is one of the elements that most disturbs experienced outdoorsmen. Animals don't avoid human structures arbitrarily. They'll investigate and claim them if they're abandoned and unthreatening. The fact that wildlife treats the forest stairs as forbidden zones suggests the stairs are broadcasting something perceptible to animal senses, something that warns them away at an instinctive level that humans don't consciously register, but that manifests as the deep unease people report feeling when they encounter the stairs. The unease is universal in accounts. People describe immediate wrongness, feeling that they're seeing something they shouldn't, that the stairs are aware of being observed, that approaching them would be a terrible mistake. Some report auditory hallucinations or actual sounds, whispers, music, voices calling from the top of the stairs. Sounds that might be wind, but that have qualities suggesting intelligence or intention. Others experience visual distortions, the air around the stairs seeming to shimmer or shift. The stairs themselves appearing to move or change position when viewed peripherally. Shadows falling from them that don't match the sun position, or that suggest something standing at the top casting shadow, despite nothing being visible. There are theories attempting to explain the staircases within conventional frameworks. Some propose they're remnants of old homesteads or logging operations, that buildings once stood in these locations, and everything else has decayed or been removed while the stairs remained because they were built more robustly or from more durable materials. But this doesn't account for the lack of any other structural remnants, for stairs that appear too well preserved given how long they'd have to have been abandoned, or for locations that are geographically unsuitable for any kind of construction and where no historical records indicate human habitation. Others suggest they're art installations or pranks, structures built by people with access to helicopters, or who carried materials deep into wilderness as elaborate hoaxes. This explains the physical presence, but struggles with the expense and effort required, with the fact that many stairs have been there for decades, according to ranger testimony, with the consistency of locations being remote enough that perpetrating such hoaxes would require extraordinary commitment, and with the question of why someone would do this repeatedly in multiple national parks and forests without ever claiming credit or being caught. The paranormal interpretations are numerous and disturbing. Some believe the stairs are dimensional doorways, physical structures that exist in multiple realities simultaneously, looking like abandoned stairs in our dimension, but potentially complete structures in adjacent dimensions. Climbing them allows you to transition between dimensions, which is why people disappear or return changed. They've experienced other realities where the stairs lead somewhere, where they connect to buildings or locations that don't exist here, where whatever rules govern that dimension can affect the climber in ways that persist when they return. Others propose the stairs are markers or traps created by non-human intelligence, entities that live in forests and use familiar structures to lure or test humans. The stairs look human-made and abandoned, trigger human curiosity, and the assumption that climbing them is safe, but they're actually designed to select for certain behaviors or characteristics, to identify humans who are curious enough or disobedient enough to climb them despite instinct warning them not to. What happens to those who climb might be abduction, might be testing, might be harvesting of some quality or substance that entity requires, or might be initiation into awareness of whatever exists in forests beyond human perception. There are also theories connecting the stairs to missing persons, particularly the missing 411 cases, documented by David Paulides, where people disappear in national parks under circumstances that don't match normal lost hiker profiles. Many disappearances occur in locations where stairs have been reported. Some bodies are found in positions or locations that are impossible to reach by normal travel, as if the person was transported. Some are found with minimal clothing despite having been properly dressed when they disappeared, or show signs of being outdoors for far longer than the timeline suggests, or are discovered alive with no memory of where they've been. Could the stairs be connected to these disappearances, serving as portals or transportation devices that move people through space in ways that leave them miles from where they vanished, or that move them through time, creating the timeline discrepancies? The warning from rangers to never climb the stairs might be based on specific incidents that are kept from public knowledge to avoid panic or lawsuits. If people have climbed stairs and died, or been injured in ways that suggest something beyond normal accidents, if they've disappeared completely, or been found in conditions that indicate they experienced something traumatic and inexplicable, then official policy would be to prevent future incidents by ensuring personnel avoid the stairs and don't draw public attention to them. The lack of written documentation would follow from the difficulties of officially recording something that shouldn't exist, and that would raise questions about what authorities know and aren't telling the public. Some experiencers report that the stairs feel inviting, that despite intellectual knowledge that they're wrong and dangerous, there's a pull to climb them, a sense that something important waits at the top, that ascending would answer questions or provide experiences worth the risk. This contradicts the fear response that most people report, suggesting either individual variation in how people respond to whatever the stairs emit, or that the stairs themselves respond differently to different people, welcoming some while warning others away, selecting who they want to interact with, based on criteria we don't understand. There are occasional reports of stairs appearing where they weren't before, as if they move or materialize rather than being permanent fixtures. A ranger might work an area for years and know every structure and feature. Then one day, encounter stairs in a location they've been past dozens of times previously, where no stairs existed. This transient quality, if accurate, would suggest the stairs aren't simply abandoned human construction, but something that operates according to different rules, that exists conditionally or travels between locations, that manifests when and where it chooses, rather than remaining fixed in space. The psychological impact on those who've encountered the stairs but resisted climbing them is significant. Many report intrusive thoughts about the stairs afterward, wondering what would have happened if they'd climbed, feeling like they missed an opportunity or narrowly avoided a fate they can't define. Some have dreams about the stairs, nightmares where they're compelled to climb despite knowing it's dangerous, or where they watch others climb and disappear. The stairs seem to leave psychological imprints that persist beyond the encounter, as if seeing them creates a connection that doesn't break just because you walked away. Children who've encountered the stairs sometimes describe seeing figures at the top, people or entities beckoning, inviting them to climb. Adults usually see nothing but empty stairs, which raises the question of whether children perceive something that adults filter out, whether their less culturally conditioned perception allows them to see the truth of what the stairs are and what stands at their terminus, or whether the stairs use visual lures specifically designed to appeal to children who are more likely to obey the impulse to climb before rational fear intervenes. The pattern of where stairs appear is difficult to determine because rangers don't officially document them, and civilians who encounter them rarely report precise locations. But there seem to be clusters in certain regions, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, the Appalachians, and areas with significant Native American history, where indigenous accounts mention spirit worlds or dimensional boundaries in forests. Whether these locations have natural properties that make the stairs more likely to appear, or whether the stairs are concentrated there for other reasons, is impossible to determine without better data. Native American legends from various tribes include references to structures in forests that shouldn't be approached, doorways or paths that lead to spirit realms, or places where the normal world and other worlds overlap. Some describe stairs or ladders as ways that spirits travel between worlds, or as tests that humans might encounter where climbing leads to transformation or disappearance. The stairs that rangers find could be manifestations of whatever phenomena these legends describe. Real structures that have always existed in forests, but that modern humans lack the cultural framework to understand, approaching them as mysterious artifacts rather than recognizing them as what indigenous traditions might identify as sacred or dangerous thresholds between realities. The question of why stairs specifically, rather than doors or holes or other portal-type structures, might relate to the human psychology of ascending. Stairs invite upward movement, suggest progression and achievement, trigger instincts to climb and see what's higher. A hole in the ground triggers fear and caution because descending into darkness activates survival fears. But stairs ascending trigger curiosity and the assumption that climbing is safe and productive. If the stairs are designed to attract or test humans, the staircase form is psychologically effective in ways that other portal designs wouldn't be. What lies at the top of the stairs, where they actually lead? What happens if you climb them fully, whether they're doorways or traps or tests, or simply structures whose purpose we can't comprehend because we lack the context to understand what they're part of? These questions remain unanswered, except through fragmented accounts from people who climbed and returned, whose testimony is often dismissed as hallucination or psychological breakdown, but who insist they experienced something real, something that proved the stairs are functional rather than decorative, that they lead somewhere that isn't empty air, but rather to spaces or states that overlap with normal forest reality in ways that allow structures to exist in both simultaneously. The official silence on the stairs is perhaps the most telling element. If they were simply abandoned homestead remnants, there would be no reason for the careful avoidance that rangers practice, no reason for the warnings passed along informally but never documented, no reason for the apparent policy of pretending they don't exist rather than investigating or removing them. The silence suggests knowledge exists that isn't being shared, that authorities understand something about the stairs that would be difficult to explain publicly, that the decision has been made to minimize interaction rather than attempt to understand or remove them, because understanding them has been tried, and the results made it clear that the best policy is avoidance. And somewhere in forests across the continent, stairs stand alone in clearings or against hillsides, ascending from earth to air, waiting. They wait for the next hiker to stumble across them and feel the pull to climb, for the next ranger to discover a new location where they've appeared, for the next person who dismisses warnings and takes those first steps upward, convinced that nothing will happen, or curious enough about what might happen to accept the risk. The stairs wait with patience that suggests they've been waiting for decades or centuries, that they'll continue waiting because time moves differently for them, or because whatever placed them operates on timescales that make human lifespans irrelevant. And eventually, someone always climbs, always takes the journey up those steps into empty air that might not be empty from the perspective of whatever reality the stairs actually occupy, and discovers what waits at the top, what purpose the stairs serve, what happens when you complete an ascent that should be impossible. But that thousands of stairs scattered through forests are silently, patiently inviting anyone who finds them to attempt, offering elevation to nowhere, as if nowhere might be somewhere we can't see, offering transit to destinations that exist in different dimensions or times or states of reality than the forest floor from which the steps rise, stairs that lead to answers. We might not survive learning, to places we might not return from, to encounters with whatever intelligence knows that humans can't resist stairs, can't see a staircase without wondering what's at the top. We'll eventually climb despite every warning, despite every instinct screaming danger, despite the absolute certainty that something is wrong with stairs that stand alone in forests miles from anywhere they should exist, ascending into air that might be solid on the other side, opening onto rooms or worlds or things we were never meant to see, but that the stairs offer access to for anyone willing or foolish enough to climb them, to step up from the forest floor and keep climbing until they reach the top, or until they reach whatever waits between the bottom and the top, for those who accept the invitation that stairs in the forest represent, the promise that impossible structures make. The doorway that looks abandoned but might simply be waiting has always been waiting. Will always be waiting for the next person to test whether stairs that lead to nowhere actually lead somewhere. Somewhere that will prove the warnings were justified, that the stairs are exactly as dangerous as rangers insist, that some structures in forests exist for purposes that have nothing to do with human comprehension and everything to do with whatever remains hidden in wilderness spaces, whatever watches from dimensions we don't see, whatever built stairs in places where no stairs should be and left them there, knowing that eventually someone would find them, would climb them, would discover what happens when you take seriously the architecture of impossible structures, and trust that stairs must lead somewhere, even when all evidence suggests they can't, even when every sense warns you to turn away, to leave them standing in the forest untouched, to resist the pull that stairs exert on human consciousness, the invitation they represent, the promise they make that somewhere up there, at the top of steps that rise from nothing, something waits worth climbing toward, even if you never return from reaching it. The Philadelphia Experiment, men fused with metal and lost in time. In October 1943, according to claims that emerged over a decade later, the U.S. Navy conducted a classified experiment at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard involving the destroyer escort USS Eldridge, attempting to achieve radar invisibility through application of Einstein's unified field theory, using massive electromagnetic generators to bend light and radar waves around the ship, making it undetectable to enemy surveillance. But something went catastrophically wrong with the experiment, and instead of merely becoming invisible to radar, the ship allegedly vanished completely from its berth in Philadelphia, teleported instantaneously to Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away, where it was briefly observed before vanishing again and reappearing back in Philadelphia. The entire incident lasting only minutes, but leaving the crew in conditions that suggested they'd experienced something far beyond simple teleportation. Sailors were reportedly found fused with the metal structure of the ship, their bodies merged with bulkheads and decks, as if the matter of flesh and steel had somehow interpenetrated during whatever dimensional or temporal displacement occurred. Others had caught fire and burned without apparent ignition source. Some had simply vanished completely, never accounted for, possibly lost in whatever space the ship traveled through. Survivors suffered severe disorientation, psychological trauma, and reported experiences of time distortion, of seeing things that shouldn't exist, of briefly existing in states where normal physics didn't apply, where their bodies became unstable and reality itself became fluid, leaving them permanently damaged by exposure to forces or dimensions that human biology isn't equipped to handle. The Navy has consistently denied that any such experiment occurred, has stated that the USS Eldridge wasn't even in Philadelphia at the time of the alleged experiment, has dismissed the entire story as fabrication and myth. But the claims persist, supported by testimonies from people claiming to have witnessed the event or to have been crew members who survived the experiment, creating one of the most enduring legends of secret military technology gone wrong, of government experiments that ventured into territory where physics becomes uncertain and where the consequences of failure include not just death, but violations of physical law, transformations of human bodies into impossible states, and psychological damage from experiencing reality in modes that consciousness cannot process without breaking, leaving the Philadelphia experiment hovering in that space between conspiracy theory and documented history, impossible to verify but impossible to completely dismiss. A story that, if true, represents one of the most significant and horrifying military disasters ever concealed, and if false, represents one of the most elaborate and persistent hoaxes in paranormal history. A narrative that has spawned books and films, and endless debate about what actually happened or didn't happen to the USS Eldridge and its crew in October 1943. The origin of the Philadelphia experiment story traces primarily to Carl Allen, also known as Carlos Allende, a former merchant marine who in 1955 sent letters to Morris K. Jessup, an astronomer and UFO researcher, claiming to have witnessed the experiment from his own ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth, which was allegedly docked nearby when the Eldridge disappeared. Allen provided specific details about the experiment, about the electromagnetic equipment involved, about the effects on the crew, about the ship's teleportation to Norfolk and back. His letters were strange, filled with unusual capitalization and underlining, written in a style that suggested either mental instability or deliberate obfuscation, making it difficult to determine whether he was reporting genuine classified information or whether he was confabulating or intentionally creating an elaborate hoax. The story gained wider attention when an annotated copy of Jessup's book, The Case for the UFO, was sent to the Office of Naval Research, marked up with handwritten comments that appeared to be from multiple people discussing secret Navy experiments, UFO propulsion systems, and other classified information. The annotations mentioned the Philadelphia experiment and seemed to corroborate Allen's claims through independent sources, though the handwriting analysis later suggested the annotations might all have been written by Allen himself, using different pens and styles, creating the illusion of multiple annotators, when actually it was a single source creating the appearance of corroboration. Morris Jessup died in 1959 under circumstances officially ruled suicide, carbon monoxide poisoning in his car. But conspiracy theorists have long suggested he was murdered because he knew too much about the Philadelphia experiment or other classified programs, that his death was disguised suicide to prevent him from revealing what he'd learned through Allen's letters and his own investigations. Whether Jessup's death was genuine suicide motivated by personal problems, or whether it was assassination remains disputed, but it added a layer of sinister implication to the Philadelphia experiment story, suggesting that knowledge of the experiment was dangerous, that authorities would kill to protect the secret. The specific claims about what happened to the crew are the most disturbing elements. Reports describe sailors whose bodies had merged with the steel structure of the ship, men embedded in bulkheads, or decks. Their flesh and bone interpenetrated with metal in ways that shouldn't be possible, in ways that suggest the atomic structure of different materials had somehow blended, or that the men had been partially phased out of normal space-time and rematerialized while occupying the same location as the ship's structure. The accounts describe attempts to extract these men from the metal, efforts that were either impossible or that resulted in their deaths, leaving bodies permanently entombed in the ship's structure or requiring amputation of the fused sections. Other crew members allegedly experienced spontaneous combustion or immolation, catching fire without apparent external ignition, burning from the inside out in ways that suggested their bodies had been affected at molecular or energetic levels by the electromagnetic fields, or by whatever forces were involved in making the ship disappear and reappear. Some survivors reportedly suffered from freezing, suddenly becoming stuck in position, unable to move, as if time had stopped for their bodies while continuing for everything around them, requiring intervention from crew members who understood the phenomenon and who could somehow restore normal temporal flow to the affected person. The psychological effects on survivors were allegedly profound and lasting. Men reported seeing dimensions or realities beyond normal perception, experiencing time non-linearly, existing simultaneously in multiple states, perceiving the ship and themselves as fluid rather than solid, as probability rather than certainty. These experiences reportedly drove some to madness, to suicide, to permanent psychiatric institutionalization, because their consciousness couldn't reconcile what they'd experienced with normal reality, couldn't return to baseline human perception after having been exposed to states of existence that violated every assumption about how reality is structured. The theoretical basis for the experiment supposedly drew on Einstein's unified field theory work, attempts to create mathematical frameworks that would unite electromagnetic forces with gravity, potentially allowing manipulation of space-time itself through controlled electromagnetic fields. If such manipulation was possible, making an object invisible by bending light around it would be a relatively simple application, but the theory would also allow for more exotic effects like teleportation, time manipulation, and dimensional displacement. Whether Einstein's work actually provided a basis for practical technology, or whether the military's interpretation and application of theoretical physics produced unexpected catastrophic results, remains unknown because the classification of the alleged project means the actual theoretical and technical details have never been publicly released. The Navy's denials are consistent and absolute. Official records show the USS Eldridge was not in Philadelphia on the dates specified, was actually on convoy duty, and can be tracked through logs and reports that place it elsewhere. The ship's crew logs show no unusual incidents, no missing personnel, no records of experimental equipment being installed or tests being conducted. The Navy states flatly that no experiment of this type ever occurred, that the technology described wouldn't be possible with 1940s science and engineering, that the entire story is fabrication without any factual basis. But conspiracy theorists note that if an experiment had gone catastrophically wrong, producing the horrific results described, the Navy would have every reason to deny it happened, to falsify records, to eliminate evidence, to relocate survivors to psychiatric facilities where their testimony would be dismissed as delusion, to do everything possible to ensure the disaster never became public knowledge. The fact that official records contradict the story doesn't disprove the story if those records are themselves fabricated or altered to cover up the incident. And some researchers claim to have found inconsistencies in the official records, gaps that might indicate alterations, personnel records that seem incomplete or modified, suggesting that something did happen that the Navy has worked to erase from documentary evidence. Testimonies from alleged survivors or witnesses have appeared over the decades, though their credibility varies widely. Some provide detailed accounts that include technical information and specific memories that seem too elaborate to be purely invented. Others make claims that seem exaggerated or that contradict each other, suggesting either that different people experience different aspects of the same event, or that at least some testimonies are fabricated or embellished. The challenge with testimony about classified military projects is that genuine witnesses would have been threatened with prosecution if they spoke publicly, meaning credible witnesses might remain silent while less credible sources feel free to come forward, creating a selection bias where the available testimony isn't necessarily representative of what actually occurred. The connection to other alleged military experiments is frequently noted. The Montauk Project, which supposedly involved time travel experiments and consciousness manipulation, is claimed by some to be a continuation of the Philadelphia experiment, using knowledge gained from the Eldridge disaster to develop more controlled methods of temporal and dimensional manipulation. Whether Montauk is real or is simply another layer of mythology built on top of the Philadelphia experiment legend is equally disputed. But the connection creates a larger narrative about secret military research into exotic physics and consciousness manipulation that spans decades. The theoretical possibility of what the Philadelphia experiment describes depends on interpretations of physics that aren't mainstream. Making an object invisible through electromagnetic manipulation of light isn't impossible in principle. Modern stealth technology achieves radar invisibility through different means, and theoretical invisibility cloaks have been proposed using metamaterials that bend light around objects. But achieving the dramatic teleportation and temporal effects described would require physics far beyond current understanding, would require that unified field theories provide not just mathematical elegance, but actual mechanisms for manipulating space-time in ways that allow matter to be moved through space instantaneously, or to exist in quantum superposition, where solid objects can interpenetrate. If the experiment did occur and did produce the catastrophic results described, the ethical implications are staggering. Using human subjects in experiments with such uncertain outcomes, experimenting with forces that might violate physical law and produce unpredictable effects on human biology and consciousness, proceeding with tests despite theoretical uncertainties that should have suggested extreme caution, all would represent gross violations of human rights and research ethics. The cover-up, if it occurred, would represent additional ethical violation, denying the victims acknowledgement of what happened to them, preventing families from learning the fates of loved ones, suppressing knowledge that might prevent similar disasters in future experiments. The cultural impact of the Philadelphia experiment story has been significant regardless of its truth. The concept that military research might venture into exotic physics with catastrophic human consequences. That classification allows experiments that violate ethics. That sailors might be used as test subjects in projects they don't understand and can't consent to meaningfully. These themes resonate with broader anxieties about military-industrial power, about secret government programs, about the dangers of pushing scientific boundaries without adequate ethical frameworks or safety protocols. Whether the Philadelphia experiment happened as described, happened in different form that was then exaggerated and mythologized, or didn't happen at all and represents pure fiction that has achieved legendary status, the story endures as one of the most vivid and disturbing narratives about secret military technology, about experiments that ventured into territory where the rules of reality become uncertain, where the consequences of failure include not just explosion or death, but violations of physical law itself, transformations that leave human bodies in states that shouldn't be possible, psychological damage from experiencing dimensions or temporal modes that consciousness can't process without breaking, and cover-up so complete that even decades later, We cannot determine with certainty whether any of it actually occurred or whether it's all elaborate mythology. Fiction that has been presented as fact or fact that has been successfully suppressed and dismissed as fiction, leaving the Philadelphia experiment in permanent uncertainty. A story that might be true or might be hoax, that describes events that might have left sailors fused with metal, might have teleported a destroyer between cities, might have exposed crew members to forces that violated their bodies and shattered their minds, or might simply be the most persistent and elaborate paranormal legend to emerge from World War II military operations, impossible to verify, but equally impossible to completely dismiss, because classified programs, by definition, don't leave evidence accessible to civilian researchers, because cover-ups, if successful, would look exactly like absence of evidence, and because the story itself, regardless of truth, captures something essential about fears regarding secret military experiments, about what might be done in the name of national security, about what technologies might be tested on unwilling or uninformed subjects, about what horrors might be concealed behind classification barriers that prevent public knowledge or accountability, leaving us wondering whether the Philadelphia experiment was real disaster that has been successfully suppressed, or whether it's cautionary fiction that warns about what could happen when military necessity meets theoretical physics at the edge of human understanding, when experiments proceed despite uncertainty, when human subjects are treated as expendable resources rather than as people with rights, when secrecy prevents oversight and classification prevents discovery, creating conditions where anything might happen and where we'd never know because the evidence would be sealed, the witnesses silenced, the records altered, and the truth buried so deeply that decades or centuries later, researchers would still be arguing about whether it happened at all, still be finding fragmentary testimonies and ambiguous evidence that suggests something occurred, but that never quite proves it definitively, leaving the USS Eldridge and its crew suspended in historical uncertainty, simultaneously disappeared and present, simultaneously myth and possible reality. The ship that might have teleported or might have simply sailed routine convoy duty. The sailors who might have fused with metal, or might have served their tours and returned home with nothing more dramatic than the usual wartime experiences. The experiment that might have pushed physics into territory where reality breaks down, or might have existed only in the imagination of Carl Allen and those who believed his strange letters, hovering forever in that liminal space between conspiracy theory and suppressed history, between fiction and fact, between impossible and merely unproven. The Philadelphia experiment that we may never definitively understand, that may remain forever uncertain, forever disputed, forever haunting the edges of military history as a reminder that some truths might be too disturbing to acknowledge, some experiments too catastrophic to admit, some violations of natural law too profound to reveal, leaving us only with stories, with testimonies of uncertain credibility, with official denials that might be truth or might be cover, with the permanent question mark that hangs over October 1943 and the USS Eldridge, and what did or didn't happen when the Navy allegedly tried to make a destroyer invisible and instead made it impossible to determine what's real and what's mythology in the bizarre tale of men fused with metal, ships teleported through space, and reality itself breaking down under the strain of forces that humans perhaps were never meant to manipulate, leaving scars on those who experienced it or on our collective imagination if it never happened at all. The 13th floor. Buildings that skip an entire level. Walk into almost any tall building and you'll notice something strange about the elevator buttons. They go from 12 to 14, skipping 13 entirely, as if that number simply doesn't exist, as if an entire floor has been erased from the building's official count. Most people accept this as superstition, a harmless concession to triskaidekaphobia. The fear of the number 13 that supposedly makes floors labeled as such harder to rent or sell. But what if the missing 13th floor isn't missing at all? What if it exists in every building that claims to skip it? A hidden level accessible only through unmarked buttons or specific key codes, a floor that operates outside normal building regulations and oversight, where things happen that were never meant to be documented or discovered. What if every major building in every major city has a 13th floor that you're not supposed to know about, occupied by entities or organizations or activities that require absolute secrecy, hidden not in remote facilities, but right in the middle of urban centers, concealed by the simple expedient of telling everyone that floor doesn't exist? The tradition of skipping 13 in building numbering started in the early 20th century, officially attributed to the superstition that 13 is unlucky. Hotels began omitting the 13th floor because guests supposedly refused to stay there. Office buildings followed because tenants wouldn't lease space on an unlucky floor. By mid-century, the practice was standard in American construction. The 12th floor is followed immediately by the 14th, and everyone pretends this is normal, that buildings somehow transition from 12 to 14 without the space in between actually existing. But architecturally, structurally, the buildings still have that level. The physical space exists. There's concrete and steel and volume between the 12th and 14th floors, regardless of what the elevator panel claims. So what's actually there? The simplest explanation that conspiracists offer is that the 13th floor houses building systems, mechanical rooms, HVAC equipment, electrical infrastructure, maintenance access. This is plausible and even verifiable in some structures where building plans show mechanical floors. But many buildings have dedicated mechanical floors elsewhere, listed honestly as such, with their utility purpose documented and accessible to engineers and maintenance staff. The 13th floor, when it's skipped, simply disappears from documentation entirely, as if acknowledging that physical space would be dangerous or revealing. No floor plans include it. No evacuation diagrams show it. It exists in the structural count, but not in the official building description. A gap in documentation that perfectly matches the physical gap represented by the missing number. There are accounts, difficult to verify but disturbingly consistent, from maintenance workers and security personnel, who claim to have accessed the actual 13th floor in buildings that officially don't have one. They describe finding unmarked elevator buttons that require specific key codes or override procedures. Buttons that aren't visible in normal operation, but that exist if you know where to look and how to activate them. When these buttons are pressed, the elevator stops at the missing floor, opening onto spaces that don't match the rest of the building's aesthetic or purpose. Government offices in commercial buildings, research laboratories in hotels, medical facilities or holding cells in residential towers, spaces that have clearly been occupied and maintained, but that serve functions completely disconnected from the building's official use. One former security guard described being called to investigate an alarm on what his display showed as floor 13, in a building that supposedly stopped at 12 and resumed at 14. He accessed the elevator override, pressed the unmarked button, and found himself in a corridor lit by different lighting than the rest of the building, fluorescent rather than the warm LED panels used elsewhere. The doors along this corridor had no numbers, only card readers, and through a door that was slightly ajar, he saw a room full of equipment he didn't recognize, servers or computers in configurations that looked medical or scientific, rather than related to any business function he knew the building housed. He reported the anomaly to his supervisor, who told him the floor was owned by a government contractor, classified operations, not his concern. Never go there again without being specifically instructed. He was assigned to a different building within the month. The pattern repeats across testimonies: maintenance staff who stumble onto the 13th floor, security personnel who accidentally access it, cleaning crews who are told certain floors are handled by specialized contractors and should never be entered. The spaces they briefly glimpse don't match what the building's public purpose would require. Office buildings contain medical equipment. Hotels have rooms that look like interrogation cells or monitoring stations. Residential buildings house technical infrastructure that suggests surveillance or communications interception far beyond what normal building management would need. And critically, the people working on these hidden floors, when they're encountered, don't engage with the accidental visitors. They don't explain what they're doing or why they're there. They simply ensure the intruder is escorted out and that access is prevented in the future. The theory extends beyond individual buildings to suggest this is systematic infrastructure, that major urban centers have a hidden level running through them, the 13th floors of all major structures, forming a network of concealed spaces that operate parallel to normal city function. Intelligence agencies, black project research, surveillance operations, storage of materials or information that can't be officially acknowledged, all potentially housed in spaces that exist physically but are edited out of official reality through the simple mechanism of declaring that floor number unlucky and omitting it from elevator panels and directory boards. It's hidden in plain sight, protected not by remote locations and armed guards, but by the psychological barrier of a cultural superstition that everyone accepts without questioning. The positioning is strategic. The 13th floor in a 20-story building is roughly 2/3 up, high enough to require elevator access, and far enough from ground level that casual observation from the street won't reveal what's happening inside, but not so high that building services become complicated, or that it's the most expensive real estate in the structure. It's the perfect location for operations that need to be physically present in urban centers, but can't be publicly acknowledged. And because the floor is officially skipped, there's no expectation that it should be accessible. No one questioning why they can't visit it. No tourists or building visitors wondering what's behind those doors, because the building claims those doors don't exist. Consider what could be done with that much concealed space across every major city. In New York alone, hundreds of buildings skip the 13th floor. If even a fraction of those physically existing floors are occupied by classified or clandestine operations, that's hundreds of hidden facilities in a single city, each potentially serving different functions. Surveillance hubs, monitoring communications traffic, storage for materials that can't be kept in official government buildings, meeting spaces for operations that require complete discretion, research laboratories conducting experiments that wouldn't pass ethical review, temporary holding facilities for individuals who can't be processed through normal legal channels. The network would be vast, distributed, and completely invisible to anyone who doesn't have access codes or override keys. The superstition itself might have been engineered or encouraged specifically to create this cover. Triskaidekaphobia existed before the building numbering convention started, but the consistent application of floor skipping across American architecture, beginning in the early 1900s, coincides with the expansion of federal government capabilities and the beginning of organized intelligence services. Was the practice adopted by a construction industry responding to tenant fears, or was it quietly encouraged and standardized to create systematic concealment for operations that required urban presence without public visibility? Once the convention was established, it became self-perpetuating. New buildings skip 13 because existing buildings do, because it's industry standard, because not doing it would be unusual. The original reason, if there was a coordinated effort to create hidden space, gets buried under layers of tradition and assumed superstition. Some researchers have noted that buildings which skip the 13th floor often show anomalies in their elevator timing. The trip from 12 to 14 takes slightly longer than the interval between other floors, suggesting the elevator is traveling the full distance, but the display is manipulated to hide the stop. Passengers don't notice because they're not paying careful attention to duration, and even if they did, slight variations in elevator speed are normal and expected. But careful timing reveals patterns. Elevators in buildings with skipped 13th floors consistently show extra travel time between 12 and 14 compared to the time between other consecutive floors. Is this just the elevator traveling further without stopping because there's no call button for 13? Or is it evidence that the elevator is stopping, that doors are opening, that something is happening during that interval that passengers aren't aware of because the display never shows 13, and their attention is focused on the numbers rather than the physical sensation of movement? There are also reports of elevator malfunctions where the 13th floor briefly appears on displays, moments of technical glitch or override failure where the hidden floor becomes momentarily visible. Passengers describe seeing 13 flash on the elevator panel for a fraction of a second before being replaced by 14, or the elevator doors beginning to open at a floor the panel doesn't acknowledge before closing again and continuing. These glitches are rare enough to be dismissed as minor technical errors, but they're consistent enough across different buildings and different cities to suggest systematic rather than random failure, as if the concealment isn't perfect, and occasionally the true building structure breaks through the official narrative. From a practical perspective, the security benefits of 13th floor concealment are enormous. No visitor logs, because visitors don't know the floor exists. No employees listing it as their workplace, because it's not in the building directory. No deliveries or mail, because there's no official address. The operations conducted there leave no trace in normal building records. No lease agreements filed with the city. No utility usage attributed to that specific floor. Everything is absorbed into the general building overhead, camouflaged by the overall power consumption and space utilization. An investigator trying to track whether something specific is happening in a building would have no reason to look for a floor that official building plans say doesn't exist. The few occasions when 13th floor operations have allegedly been exposed or acknowledged are quickly suppressed or explained away. A news story about government surveillance equipment found in a major urban building gets clarified that it was on the building's mechanical floor, with no mention that mechanical floors usually have their own designation, and that equipment was found in space the building officially doesn't count. Maintenance contracts mention servicing all floors, including mechanical spaces, without specifying which spaces those are, or whether they align with publicly accessible floors. The language is always carefully vague, creating plausible explanations that don't require acknowledging hidden levels. Children sometimes notice the discrepancy that adults have learned to ignore. They ask why the elevator goes from 12 to 14, where the 13th floor is, whether it's really just missing or if it's hidden. Adults give them the standard explanation about superstition, and most children accept this and stop asking. But some remember the question, carry it forward, and later realize that the adult explanation doesn't actually answer the architectural reality. The floor has to exist physically. Buildings don't skip levels structurally just because the buttons don't acknowledge them. The space is there, something occupies it. The question is what and why the answer requires pretending the space doesn't exist, rather than simply acknowledging it, serves purposes that are classified or proprietary. There's psychological conditioning involved in the acceptance of missing 13th floors. We're trained from early age to accept that superstition justifies gaps in logic, that something can officially not exist even though physically it must be present. This creates mental flexibility that extends beyond building numbering. If we accept one convenient fiction without questioning the underlying contradiction, we're more likely to accept other official narratives that don't quite match observable reality. The missing 13th floor becomes practice for accepting cognitive dissonance, for not asking questions about gaps in official explanations, for believing what we're told, even when direct observation suggests something different. In some buildings, the 13th floor is acknowledged but renamed, called the mezzanine, or given a letter designation, or folded into a split-level scheme that obscures the actual floor count. This variation suggests different approaches to the same goal, creating space that exists physically but isn't numbered or designated in a way that maps clearly to the building's apparent structure. You can't go to floor 13 because 13 doesn't exist, and you can't go to mezzanine level M because you don't have authorization. And the fact that mezzanine M happens to be positioned where floor 13 should be is just architectural coincidence, nothing worth examining too carefully. What makes the 13th floor theory particularly unsettling is its mundane plausibility. It doesn't require advanced technology or exotic physics. It's just careful numbering, cultural convention, and willingness to not ask questions about spaces we're told don't need acknowledgement. Every day, millions of people ride elevators through buildings where they travel past a floor they're not allowed to know about, where the elevator might even stop briefly to let someone on or off at a level that doesn't register on the display. And they never notice because they're trusting the numbers rather than paying attention to the physical reality of movement and space. If you're in a tall building right now, there might be a 13th floor directly above or below you. Equipment might be running there, people might be working there, operations might be proceeding there that you'll never learn about because officially that space doesn't exist. The floor isn't hidden in any exotic sense. It's not cloaked or dimensionally shifted. It's just not numbered, not acknowledged, not included in the count that visitors and tenants are shown. And that simple omission, that convenient fiction maintained through architectural convention and cultural superstition, creates perfect cover for activities that require urban presence but can't withstand public awareness. The 13th floor exists in every building that claims to skip it. The question is, what's happening there while everyone below and above goes about their daily business? Riding elevators that travel past secrets concealed not through sophisticated technology, but through nothing more than a missing button and a number that was declared unlucky long ago. Perhaps for reasons that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with creating systematic concealment that would persist for generations without anyone thinking to question why a floor that must physically exist is treated as if it simply isn't there. The Pascagoula, abduction, floating beings with no faces. On the evening of October 11th, 1973, two shipyard workers, Charles Hickson, age 42, and Calvin Parker, age 19, were fishing on the west bank of the Pascagoula River in Mississippi when they claimed to have been taken aboard a craft by entities that defied every expectation of what alien beings should look like. Creatures so bizarre and so unlike the typical gray aliens that would come to dominate abduction narratives that their very strangeness lends credibility. Suggests that if this was fabrication, the witnesses chose descriptions that were remarkably unconventional and difficult to hoax. The beings were described as roughly 5 feet tall, with wrinkled gray skin that looked robotic or mechanical, with no discernible eyes, no mouths, no recognizable facial features at all, just smooth or featureless areas where faces should be. They had crab-like or mitten-like appendages instead of hands. And most disturbingly, they didn't walk but floated or glided above the ground, moving without apparent locomotion, defying gravity in ways that added to the profound wrongness of their appearance and behavior. 3 of these entities allegedly emerged from an oval-shaped craft that produced a buzzing sound, approached the terrified men through floating rather than walking, and despite having no visible means of communication, somehow paralyzed both witnesses, lifted them through floating or levitation into the craft, subjected them to examination that Hickson described as mechanical and invasive, while Parker claimed to have fainted from fear and remembered little, and then returned them to the riverbank. Approximately 20 minutes after the encounter began, leaving them traumatized, disoriented, and with a story so strange that when they reported it to local sheriff's department, investigators were initially skeptical, but became convinced through various means that the witnesses genuinely believed their account, that they were exhibiting real trauma rather than performing deception, making the Pascagoula abduction one of the most compelling and best documented early abduction cases, distinguished by the witnesses' consistency, by their genuine distress, by the unusual nature of the entities described, and by the fact that both men maintained their stories until death. Hickson until his death in 2011, and Parker, who despite decades of trauma and reluctance to discuss the encounter, eventually came forward again to reaffirm that what happened was real, that he was taken aboard a craft by beings that had no faces, that floated rather than walked, that examined him through means he couldn't understand or adequately describe, leaving both men forever changed by 20 minutes of missing time and encounter with entities so strange that they don't fit easily into established UFO narratives, that represent something genuinely other if the account is accurate, something that wasn't human but also wasn't the familiar gray aliens of later abduction accounts, something that seemed mechanical or robotic, but that moved with purpose and intention, something that appeared to be conducting examination or research, but that communicated nothing, that had no faces to read emotion from, that gave no indication of why they were there or what they wanted, except that they took two men fishing on a river and returned them 20 minutes later with memories of levitating aboard a craft and being examined by faceless floating beings that violated every expectation of how entities should appear or behave, making the Pascagoula abduction either genuine encounter with non-human intelligence of type we haven't encountered before or since, or elaborate hoax sustained by two men for decades despite offering them more trauma and difficulty than benefit, despite Parker in particular suffering such severe psychological effects that he avoided discussing the incident for decades and only reluctantly acknowledged it later in life, suggesting that whether the beings were real or hallucination or something else, the experience was genuine and was traumatic, was something that happened to these men in their perception, even if it didn't happen in shared objective reality, leaving the Pascagoula abduction as one of UFO history's most fascinating and disturbing cases. One of the few where the entities described don't fit templates, don't match expectations, don't conform to the cultural narratives about what aliens should look like, making them either more credible because they're not borrowed from science fiction, or more suspicious because they're so strange that they seem designed to be unbelievable, depending on whether you interpret unconventional details as evidence of authenticity or evidence of creative fabrication, leaving the case as it has been for over 50 years. Compelling, disturbing, well-documented, and ultimately unresolved. The immediate aftermath of the incident is well documented because the witnesses went directly to sheriff's department, arriving clearly distressed, Hickson calm but shaken, and Parker so terrified he was nearly incoherent, requiring medical attention for what appeared to be psychological shock. The sheriff, initially skeptical, used standard investigative technique of leaving the witnesses alone in a room with a hidden recording device, expecting them to discuss their fabricated story or break character when they believed they weren't being monitored. The recording instead captured genuine distress, Parker sobbing and asking Hickson if the experience had really happened, Hickson reassuring him in tones suggesting genuine belief rather than conspiratorial coordination, creating audio record that convinced investigators the witnesses weren't consciously perpetrating hoax, that they genuinely believed something had happened to them even if what happened remained unclear. Both men were subjected to polygraph examinations. Hickson passed unequivocally. The examiner concluded he was telling the truth as he believed it. Parker was too distressed to complete examination initially, but later took polygraphs that also indicated truthfulness. Polygraphs aren't infallible. They measure physiological stress responses that correlate with deception, but that can be affected by various factors. But they do indicate that the witnesses weren't consciously lying, weren't experiencing the physiological patterns associated with intentional fabrication, suggesting that whatever happened, the witnesses genuinely believed their account. The physical evidence was minimal: no unusual radiation, no soil samples showing anomalies, no physical traces at the site beyond the normal riverbank environment. The craft allegedly landed or hovered near the bank, but left no impressions or burns. The witnesses had no unusual marks on their bodies beyond Hickson's report of soreness consistent with the invasive examination he described. The absence of physical evidence doesn't disprove the account, but does mean verification relies entirely on witness testimony and behavior, rather than on objective material traces that could be analyzed independently. The description of the entities is the most distinctive element. 5 feet tall, gray, wrinkled skin with texture described as robotic or elephant-like. No visible eyes or facial features beyond slight indentations or protrusions that might have served sensory functions. Crab-like or mitten-like appendages that ended in pincer-like or stumped formations, rather than fingers. Most bizarrely, they floated or glided several inches above ground, moving horizontally without leg movement, without visible propulsion, as if suspended by forces that weren't apparent to the witnesses. This floating locomotion added to the profound wrongness of the encounter, made the beings seem even more alien than their appearance alone would suggest. The lack of faces is particularly disturbing because humans are hardwired to recognize faces, to find faces in ambiguous patterns, to derive social and emotional information from facial features. Beings with no faces violate this fundamental human perceptual system, create entities that can't be read, that provide no feedback, that offer no indication of intention or emotion through the facial cues that humans rely on for social interaction. Whether this was actual characteristic of the entities, or whether it was how witnesses' brains processed beings whose faces were so alien that human face recognition systems couldn't parse them into comprehensible features is ambiguous, but the effect was traumatizing. Being examined by beings you can't read, whose intentions are completely opaque, whose very appearance suggests they're not biological in ways you understand. The mechanical quality described by witnesses is intriguing. The beings moved in coordinated mechanical ways, floated with precision, conducted the examination with what seemed like programmed efficiency rather than curiosity or scientific interest. This has led to speculation that the entities were robots or biological machines, that what Hickson and Parker encountered weren't living beings, but rather automated systems sent to conduct examinations, which might explain the lack of faces. They didn't need faces because they weren't conscious entities requiring expression or communication, but rather were programmed collectors executing pre-programmed examination protocols. But if they were robotic, who or what built them? The craft they emerged from was described as oval or fish-shaped, producing buzzing or zipping sounds, appearing solid and metallic. If the faceless beings were drones, the intelligence that created and deployed them remained hidden during the encounter, directing the examination from elsewhere, either from within the craft's interior that the witnesses didn't see, or from remote location, or through automated systems that required no active direction. This interpretation makes the encounter less about meeting alien intelligence directly, and more about being processed by their automated systems, being examined by machines while the actual intelligence remains inaccessible and unknowable. The paralysis both men experienced is consistent with other abduction accounts. They described being unable to move, being lifted or floated into the craft against their will, but without physical force, rather through some mechanism that controlled their bodies or that suspended them in fields that prevented movement. Hickson remained conscious throughout and remembered the examination involving a large, eye-like device that moved over his body, scanning or analyzing him. Parker claims to have fainted from terror early in the experience and remembered little beyond the initial approach of the beings, suggesting that different individuals respond differently to the paralysis or to whatever consciousness-affecting systems the entities or craft employed. The 20-minute duration is notable because it's brief compared to many abduction accounts that involve hours of missing time. The witnesses were returned quickly, suggesting either that the examination was efficient and required minimal time, or that time passed differently for the witnesses than for external observers, or that the beings had specific limited objectives that didn't require extended captivity. The brevity might also make the account more credible. It's not elaborated into hours of complex procedures and interactions that would provide more opportunity for confabulation or inconsistency. The location is less remote than many abduction sites. The west bank of the Pascagoula River near a shipyard isn't isolated wilderness. It's near industrial development and population centers. Choosing such a location seems risky if avoiding detection was priority, unless the beings didn't care about being observed, or unless they had capabilities that made detection by others unlikely even in relatively populated areas. No other witnesses have come forward claiming to have seen the craft or the incident, despite it allegedly occurring near dusk when some people would have been active in the area, though absence of corroborating witnesses doesn't prove the event didn't occur, just that if it did occur, it was somehow limited to the immediate vicinity of the two men. The aftermath for both men was severe. Parker, in particular, suffered psychological trauma that affected his life for decades, developed anxiety and stress-related health problems, avoided public attention and discussion of the incident, despite it being a defining event of his life. This doesn't seem consistent with hoaxer behavior. People who fabricate sensational stories typically seek attention and benefit from their notoriety, whereas Parker fled from attention and suffered significantly from being associated with the incident. Hickson handled the attention better, but also maintained consistency in his account across decades, participating in UFO conferences and interviews, but never embellishing significantly beyond his original report, never adding dramatic elaborations that would make the story more compelling or marketable. The cultural impact was significant. The Pascagoula abduction became one of the first widely publicized abduction cases, predating the Betty and Barney Hill cases, full cultural absorption, and occurring years before the gray alien archetype became dominant in abduction narratives. The uniqueness of the Pascagoula entities, faceless, floating, robotic, means they didn't become templates for subsequent reports, suggesting they weren't created from existing cultural expectations about alien appearance, and weren't subsequently copied by hoaxers or confabulators who would have been more likely to describe grays if they were borrowing from abduction narratives. The skeptical explanations focus on several possibilities. Misidentified mundane phenomenon, perhaps military testing of equipment that created lights and sounds that frightened the witnesses, combined with sleep deprivation, or psychological states that created hallucinatory experience of entities and abduction. This struggles with the specificity of the description and the sustained trauma both men exhibited, which seems excessive for misidentifying conventional phenomenon, even combined with hallucination. Hoax is possible, but seems unlikely given the lack of benefit to the witnesses. The sustained consistency across decades, Parker's evident suffering and reluctance to profit from the incident, and the audio recording from the sheriff's department that captured apparently genuine distress when the witnesses believed they weren't being monitored. If hoax, it was remarkably committed and remarkably unrewarding for those perpetrating it. Psychological explanation involving shared delusion, or folie à deux, where one witness's belief contaminated the other, is theoretically possible, but doesn't easily account for the immediate onset. They went from normal phishing to shared complex, detailed hallucination of abduction without apparent trigger or precedent, and both maintained the delusion with remarkable consistency despite it causing significant life difficulties. Sleep paralysis with hypnagogic hallucinations seems unlikely, given that both men were allegedly conscious and active, fishing on a riverbank when the encounter began, not in the transitional sleep states where paralysis typically occurs. The extraterrestrial hypothesis remains most straightforward interpretation if the account is accurate. Non-human intelligent entities in a craft took 2 humans for brief examination and returned them, with the entities having appearance and capabilities that don't match human biology or technology. The faceless floating beings would be actual aliens conducting research or surveillance, with appearance and behavior that's strange to us, but that's normal for them, and with technology allowing paralysis, levitation, and examination through means we don't possess or understand. The interdimensional hypothesis proposes the entities came from adjacent dimension rather than from distant planet, that the craft wasn't spaceship but dimensional portal or vehicle, that the beings appeared faceless and mechanical because they're not fully manifesting in our dimensional space, that we're seeing partial projection of entities that exist primarily elsewhere. This explains the strangeness of their appearance and behavior through dimensional mismatch rather than through alien biology. Whether the Pascagoula abduction represents genuine encounter with non-human intelligence, represents psychological or perceptual phenomenon affecting both witnesses simultaneously, represents misidentification and confabulation, or represents something else that current frameworks don't adequately describe. The case remains compelling because the witnesses were consistent, were genuinely affected, and described entities that don't fit established patterns, that seem too strange to be borrowed from existing narratives, and too specific to be easily dismissed as generic hallucination. The faceless beings that floated rather than walked, that had no eyes but somehow sensed their environment, that examined humans through means that seemed mechanical and impersonal, that took 20 minutes out of 2 men's lives and left them forever changed, remain one of UFO history's most distinctive and disturbing reported encounters. One of the few cases where the witnesses maintained their accounts until death despite considerable personal cost. One of the few where the entities described are so unusual that they challenge both believers and skeptics to explain how 2 men fishing on a river could generate or encounter such specific strangeness, leaving the Pascagoula abduction as it has always been: strange, compelling, disturbing, unresolved, and dominated by the image of beings with no faces floating through the darkness, conducting their examination and then returning their subjects to the riverbank. As if 20 minutes of missing time and encounter with the profoundly alien was just another Thursday evening in Mississippi, just another unexplained incident in the long history of humans reporting contact with entities that don't fit our understanding of what should be possible, what should exist, what should be floating through the darkness, taking people aboard craft to examine them through means we don't understand for purposes we can only speculate about. The faceless beings that Hickson and Parker encountered, that they reported, that they never recanted, that they took to their graves as defining traumatic experience that was either real encounter with non-human intelligence, or was hallucination so powerful and so specific that it functioned as encounter, that created trauma equivalent to actual abduction, whether or not actual abduction occurred, leaving the Pascagoula case as permanent testimony to something: genuine alien contact, psychological phenomenon, shared delusion, misidentification, or mystery that transcends these categories, that happened to two men fishing on a river, that involved beings with no faces that floated rather than walked, that changed both men forever, and that remains, after 5 decades, one of the most compelling and least explained abduction accounts in the history of UFO phenomena. A case that refuses easy dismissal, that challenges simple explanations, that suggests that if abductions are real, the entities involved are far stranger than the gray aliens of popular culture, far more disturbing in their featureless faces and their floating locomotion and their mechanical indifference. The beings that took Hickson and Parker examined them and returned them, leaving us with their story, with their consistency, with their trauma, and with the question of what actually happened on October 11th, 1973, on the west bank of the Pascagoula River, when two men fishing encountered something that had no faces, that floated through the darkness, that took them aboard a craft and changed them forever, leaving the case unsolved, unexplained, and permanently disturbing in its specificity, in its strangeness, in its suggestion that the universe contains beings so unlike us that they violate every expectation, that they float without walking, that they examine without faces, that they exist in ways we can barely comprehend, and that encountering them is experience that marks you permanently, that trauma that persists across decades, that memory that can't be dismissed or explained away, no matter how much you wish it could be. The faceless beings that float in the darkness, that the Pascagoula witnesses encountered, that might be there still, examining, collecting, conducting their incomprehensible research on humans they select for reasons we don't understand, returning them traumatized and changed, leaving cases like Pascagoula as permanent questions in the historical record, as permanent mysteries that suggest reality is stranger than we acknowledge, that the universe contains beings that float and have no faces, and that take people and return them, leaving only the testimony, only the trauma, only the question of what they were, what they wanted, and whether they'll return.